Hi, Rob. Sorry we didn't get to meet, but I hope that these answers will give you at least a beginning for a conversation, and then we can continue from there. So, question number one: Science and scientists increasingly to make it clear that they're doing. Some say that science doesn't need to fit a one-liner. What is your stance on this? Do you see it, and does it harm science? So I do see it. In terms of whether it harms science, I actually see it as a two-edged sword. I think as scientists, we are using public money to fund our research. Even when we have private universities, in many cases the research is still funded by private, by the government in some way or another. And because of that, I think that scientists have a responsibility uh, to to the community, and we do have a responsibility to the people who are paying taxes. And I think remembering that we are using taxpayers' money to fund the research is actually a helpful thing in many cases. Sometimes scientists can go ahead and do something that is interesting for them that is a little hard to justify to anybody else. So having some kind of um, responsibility in that regard, I think is not that bad. Now, is it always positive? Of course not, because sometimes there are things that are too complex and too difficult and might not make a good PR. So if you say in the total scheme of things, if there are things that make a good PR and things that don't make good PR, could it be that some things would be overfunded and some things would be underfunded? I think that's probably going to have an effect. Um, but I suspect that um, even for complex things, it should be our responsibility as scientists to try and explain why this is the case. And then when we can't win the battle in the public opinion poll, there's other ways to fund research. This is why a government is doing it, and private foundations and so on. So overall, I can see both points, um, both sides of it, but I think there's also advantage. Um, Question number two: What do you believe the uptake should be of your research and results? For example, the research on bonuses in India. Do companies consider this way of incentivizing or stick to it? So far, I haven't had a single company that says, "Oh, I love this result. I think this would apply to my case as well," and be willing to just change the procedures that they are currently engaged in. And I think that's actually okay, because I don't want companies to just change what they're doing all of a sudden. What I'm hoping is that companies would look at this and would say, "Hey, this is different than what I expected. This is not what I would predict happens there. Could it be that things would not also work as I expect them in my company? And then if this is the case, maybe we should do some experiments and try to see whether my result in my organization would be different as well." And I see this happening. We're working with a few big organizations on employee motivations. Now, granted, we're starting with low-level employees, kind of people in the production line and call centers, but I think this is a good start. The next question: Your book and research are accessible and fun. How is this regarded by fellow scientists? So, like everything else, I think there's good and bad. There's some people who are thinking I'm oversimplifying things, and there's some people who I think wish that they wrote this book, or that they wrote their own book, or they think that I preempted them for that. But I think in many ways people appreciate the fact that it's bringing more attention to the field, and students seem more excited, and it becoming easier to teach and explain why this is important. So mostly I see this as a positive reaction, with some exception of you know negative human traits that you can imagine what they are. And it's hard to deal with, but I I I think that overall the good outweigh the best. You do not shy away from personal details. Uh, um, and the question is, why is that? So of course I don't detail everything else, everything about my life. But um, in the first book, I described some personal things because I thought it was important not just to kind of reveal myself, but to bring about the question of how did I get to where I got? How did the question emerge? And when I was very young, I read some books on inventors, mostly engineers, and how they became to invent the motorcycle and the plane and so on. And I remember their personal story and how they got there was really interesting for me. And I think for social science, because it's the science of everyday life, I think this was particularly important for me. Like, what is the journey? How did you get to think about this? What is the thought? This is what the story is about. It's about how you take something in your life, you observe it, you look at it, you think about it, and then you test it. So for me, the part about the stories about my life and how they led to the research is an integral part of the understanding of how this is. Now, in the first book, I was personal. And then what happened was that I met people who read the book and they talked to me and they talked to me as if they knew me very well. And then when I wrote the second book, I had them in mind and made it even easier to write a more personal book. So I think being personal kind of is a progress. You do something, the other person reveals something. And for me, the first book was a step. I got lots of emails from people as a second step. I still get lots of incredibly personal email from people. And because of that, I think there's kind of a tremendous intimacy between, or not tremendous, there's some really substantial intimacy between me and some of my readers, which is really quite fantastic. Um, the next question. We see the US as an innovation powerhouse. Eric Schmidt letter to the Washington Post of a couple of years ago talk about the US innovation deficit. The Obama administration started education and innovative and other STEM-related program. Is the US losing its position, do you believe? Hard for me to tell. I mean, there's a lot of mechanisms within the US, within the startup community. There's lots of mechanisms within the funding. There's lots of local initiatives that I think are really very, very impressive and very hopeful. I think there's a question of whether the country as a whole is the government doing anything, or is it just coming from um, local activities, and I think it's shifting to local activities rather than the government. And it probably has some negative things, but probably has some positive things. I worry in particular about STEM education, like everybody should, because um, kind of at the basis, without some understanding of technology, math, and science, this is not going to be sustainable. There's lots of wonderful innovations out there to be made, but there's lots of science that needs to be done. Um, Yesterday, the report for Diederik Stapel was released, making up favorable that he made up stuff. How serious do you believe this is? A permanent blemish of science or a hype? I don't think it's a hype. I think it's a real issue that science needs to deal with. I think that much like the economic crisis and the banking crisis, and it causing us to look at banking and the incentives and the misalignment of incentives, I think we need to think similarly about academia and academic research and what are the incentives and so on. So, uh, I think this is something that we need to consider, and I think it needs to make us think about how we want to create science now. Has it really blemished science for a long time? I don't think so. I think it's a I think it's a blip. I think it's a serious blip. I think we need to do something about it. Um, but I hope that the actions that we will take to make science as a whole better, stronger, more robust. Science has this wonderful feature that if other people find different results, they can publish it, right? So if somebody publish one result and somebody else finds the opposite, they can publish it. In fact, just last week, somebody published a paper showing that an effect that I said was very big, they created a different method to estimate it, and they said it was smaller. It was still big, but it was a smaller effect. Now, I don't get upset, right? This is how science is. You think you have one thing, and then somebody else comes and finds something else. I think science has the self-correcting mechanism. Now, when you invent data, of course, that's a different story. But science has this corrective mechanism. The problem is it's an expensive mechanism, and it will be better off if we don't need to correct that much. So I think that if science would look at what we've done so far critically and think about how to fix things, that would be great. Last question. Freakonomic is also a New York Times bestseller. It's a great bestseller. To what extent is their work compatible? So, um, in some sense, we're kind of the opposite. I mean, Levitt is an incredibly clever statistician. He looks at data in a very, very interesting way and find ways to use data to answer very, very interesting questions. I do the opposite in the sense that I don't look at kind of natural data, I look at experiments. It's also the case that we're opposite because he looks at the half rational part of the glass and I look at the half empty. So if you think about, for example, his research on real estate agents, he said, oh, you thought that real estate agents look just for your benefit. No, 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 here is some evidence that they are selfish. And he's showing that they thought they actually behave much more like the economic selfish agent that you think they would. Now, in my research, I also point out that they are not behaving perfectly selfishly, right? It's true that people behave selfishly, but it's not perfectly selfish way. So while I think that the Dubner-Levitt freakonomics approach is basically looking at the rational part of human behavior, it's all the places where we think people would act not in a rational way, but they do react to incentives in a direction predicted by the rational theory. And I focus on the fact that this is not perfectly rational, but there's lots of things that are missing as well. So this is the big difference between us. I think there's lots of compatibility, but also differences. Okay, I hope this helps. Take care and all the best.